Boldwood presents Just the Beginning, written by Sarah Bennett and read by Fran Burgoyne. Chapter 1. What about these? Anya paused in the act of folding her daughter's clothes to glance over to where her cousin Chloe was holding up a set of picture books. A flood of memories of sitting in the antique rocking chair Drew had found for Freya's nursery as she'd read and reread those stories almost dropped Anya to her knees. The antique rocking chair had been loaded onto the back of the bailiff's van the previous week, along with pretty much everything else of value in the house. They'd left the beds, some kitchen basics, and those personal effects not deemed valuable enough to auction off. Everything else had gone, including the designer labels and blingy jewellery Drew had insisted on showering Anya with. A very apologetic man had called only yesterday to ask her if she was aware that the majority of the stones were worthless reproductions. Anya had laughed to the point of hysterics, because wasn't that just the perfect representation of her life with Drew? "Annie?" Chloe's gentle question brought Anya back to the present. "Sorry, let's take them. Freya's probably outgrown most of those, but she'll need some familiar things around her. Let's pack all of her toys, too." There wasn't going to be a lot of space at her aunt and uncle's place, but her daughter had been through so much since that freezing early January night the previous year, when the police had shattered their lives with a late-night knock at the door. Chloe nodded. "Good idea. We can look at replacing things gradually once she's settled in at home." Anya quirked her lips into her best semblance of a smile. There hadn't been anything to smile about since Drew's death, so it was a case of relying on muscle memory. Given she had the sum total of about £30 in her purse, both she and Freya were going to have to make do with what they had for some considerable time to come. None of which was Chloe's fault. Her cousin was just doing her best to try and keep Anya's spirits up. Setting aside the pretty pink cardigan she'd been folding, Anya crossed the room and put her arms around Chloe. "Thank you for doing this with me." Chloe's return hug was instantaneous. "As if we would leave you to try and deal with this mess on your own." "I know, but it's not fair that we're all turning your lives upside down like this." Chloe leaned back so she could catch Anya's eye. "Hey, listen. I wouldn't wish your circumstances on anyone, but I promise you that we are delighted that you and Freya are moving to Halfmoon Quay to be with us." Anya nodded. Growing up, she would have given everything in the world to live in Halfmoon Quay. The pretty village clinging to the edge of the Cornish coast had been a haven in comparison to the boring, privet-hedged suburb she'd lived in, on the outskirts of one of the many commuter towns that encircled London. In a roundabout way, Anya had indeed given everything, and now that childhood wish was coming true. Be careful what you wish for. Wasn't that always the moral of fairy tales? Her Aunt Helen poked her head around the door. "Matt's nipping to the shop to grab some sandwiches for lunch. What would you both like?" Her expression softened as she saw the cardigan Anya had been folding on the bed. Entering the room, she picked it up and brushed a hand over the pretty flowers stitched around the border. "I remember when Freya wore this for your mum's wedding. Have you heard from her recently?" Anya shook her head. "Not beyond the odd WhatsApp message." Lisa, Anya's mother and Helen's sister, had got married the previous autumn to a lovely man called Bill she'd met on a cruise. Lisa had wanted to postpone the wedding given it had been less than a year since Drew's death, but Anya had urged her to go ahead. Her life had been lurching from bad to worse, the police having advised her they had questions about the car accident that had killed Drew. Knowing in her gut there was more trouble to come, Anya had wanted her mother to embrace her own happiness and hadn't breathed a word to anyone until she'd had no choice. Over the course of the following few months, all Anya's worst fears, and several that had never even entered her head, had played out. First, the police road traffic accident investigation unit had been unable to recreate a scenario that didn't involve Drew deliberately steering his car off the road, and had submitted a report to the coroner stating that. As a result, the insurers had refused to pay out a penny, and as the unpaid bills piled up, Anya had learned the shocking truth about her husband's dodgy business dealings. Still, she'd kept quiet, unable to find the words to express not only her disbelief in what Drew had been up to, but the anger she felt towards herself for being so bloody naive. While it was true that Drew had rebuffed even the smallest inquiry into their finances, Anya hadn't tried all that hard to dig deeper, content to live in her own little bubble. It was only when the bank told her they were going to repossess the house that she'd had no choice but to admit to her family the full scale of the disaster Drew had left her to deal with. By the time Anya had come clean, Lisa and Bill had relocated to a lovely little villa in the Canary Islands as part of their early retirement plans. Lisa had been furious with Anya for letting her go ahead. But what else had she been supposed to do? There was no way she was going to spoil her mother's happiness, or Bill's for that matter, because of what Drew had done. They'd worked their entire lives and had earned what they had. Anya's mum in particular had struggled to make ends meet after her dad walked out on them. Doing anything that would risk her hard-earned financial security was an anathema to Anya. Unfortunately, her refusal to take a penny from them had caused something of a rift, and they were currently only communicating via WhatsApp messages. Though Anya missed talking to her mum, the distance was a relief compared to the fractious rows that had ended with them both in tears. She knew she could fix things tomorrow if she accepted their offer of financial help. But Anya was adamant. Drew had ruined enough lives with his schemes and lies. She would not add her own mother to the list. Sheer desperation had forced her to accept her aunt and uncle's offer to move in with them. Matt, their son and Anya's cousin, had moved out recently to share a cottage with Ed, a cousin on his father's side of the family, and they'd converted the old summer house at the end of their garden into a studio apartment for Chloe. Without giving her a chance to refuse, Chloe had moved back into her old bedroom and told Anya the apartment was hers for as long as she needed it. Anya had only accepted because she literally had no other choice. Freya needed a roof over her head and Anya needed a job. With the summer season about to start, she hoped she'd be able to pick something up. Anything would do as long as it brought in enough money to at least feed them. It was her Aunt Helen's turn to hug her. "Give her time, lovely, and she'll come around." Anya nodded. I don't blame her. There were only two people she blamed for the situation she found herself in. Drew, for being a liar their entire life together, and herself, for letting him fool her so completely and utterly. Helen hugged her again. "I'd better get downstairs and finish up. I'll tell Matt to get a selection of sandwiches, okay?" "Okay." Anya didn't care what he got, because she'd lost her appetite weeks ago when the full horror of her situation had become clear. She still ate, but only because she needed to stay healthy for Freya's sake. At least she wasn't there to see them packing up what was left of the only home she'd ever known. Helen and Ryan had bought them train tickets, and Anya had taken Freya down to Halfmoon Quay the previous weekend. She was staying with Chloe's grandparents while the rest of the family had piled into their cars and travelled back up to Surrey to collect the last of their belongings. Knowing the inevitable was coming, Anya had been thinning out for the past couple of weeks, selling what she could or donating it to charity shops and recycling or dumping the rest. It had given her something to do in the evenings while Freya was asleep, and she'd found it somewhat cathartic. Drew's stuff had gone first, and it had been like a weight lifting off her shoulders, giving her the boost she needed to tackle the rest. There was no trace of him left in the house other than in the photo albums Anya had tucked away in the bottom of a box. Her first instinct had been to toss the lot on a bonfire in the back garden. But Freya didn't know the truth about her father, and Anya had sworn the rest of the family to secrecy. Anya knew how hard it was to grow up without a father, her own having left when she wasn't much older than Freya was now. She hadn't even had the illusion that he was a good man, having snuck downstairs when she should have been in bed and overheard her mum and Aunt Helen talking about what a bastard he was over a bottle of wine. She'd been too young to understand what that word had meant, only that it was something bad, and had crept back to bed and cried herself to sleep. One day, when she was old enough, Anya would tell her daughter the truth if she asked about him, but for now, if looking at Drew's photo brought Freya comfort, she would hold her peace. By the time Matt called up the stairs to let them know he was back, Anya and Chloe had finished the packing, and 3 suitcases and half a dozen cardboard boxes were stacked on the landing next to a couple of bags of things she'd decided not to keep after all. Anya sealed the top of the final box with tape and sighed. Not much to show for the past 10 years, is it? Chloe put her arm around Anya's waist and hugged her. It's time to stop worrying about the past, Annie. What's done is done, and from now on you have to focus on the future, on what's best for you and Freya. Anya nodded. Yes, you're right. At the end of the day, she's all that matters. Her Uncle Ryan was coming back through the front door as they reached the bottom of the stairs. Giving Anya his most encouraging smile, he rubbed his hands together. Right, the kitchen is just about done and the boxes are on the trailer. There's just a few plates and mugs, and the kettle, of course, but those will take 5 minutes to sort out. How are you getting on upstairs? That's done as well. We've left everything at the top of the stairs. He nodded. Matt and I will grab it all after lunch. He hesitated, his smile softening into something kinder. Anya's gut clenched, knowing what he was going to say. That just leaves your workshop. Anya swallowed around the lump in her throat. Everything in there can go. Oh, Annie, no! Chloe's dismayed gasp was followed immediately by her uncle saying, But darling, your sewing machine means the world to you, and all that material you've collected over the years, it'd be a waste just to throw it all away. Surely you'll find some use for it. If Anya hadn't spent so much time hiding away in her workshop making clothes and furnishings for the house, perhaps she'd have noticed what Drew had been up to. Knowing she'd indulged in a little fantasy world while in the real world people had lost their jobs, their homes, their marriages to the string of failed businesses Drew had set up and abandoned, made her feel sick inside. If she'd been able to sell some of the things she'd made, she might not have felt like she'd completely wasted her life on nothing more than an indulgent hobby. The evaluator from the bailiffs had kicked that notion in a matter of minutes when, after a cursory flick through the contents of her workshop, he'd declared nothing in there worth the cost of storage. I don't have the space. Ryan winked at her. Don't worry about that. We'll find room. I was only thinking the other day that I haven't sorted out the sheds in a long time. I bet if I went through them, I could empty one out and convert it into a workshop for you. I know it won't be the same as what you've got now, but it'd be something to tide you over. That's a great idea, Dad, Chloe chipped in. Anya knew she meant well, they all did. But for a moment she wished she'd found another way to resolve her problems that hadn't involved turning to her family. It was an unkind thought, and she regretted it immediately. She felt even more churlish when Chloe took her hand and squeezed it gently. Hey, Mum and I will sort out the workshop while you hoover around upstairs, okay? Anya closed her eyes against a sudden pricking of tears, and she was simply too tired to argue about it. Okay. Chapter 2. Anya's brave face held all the way through the long drive back to Halfmoon Quay. Perhaps sensing how close to the edge she was, Chloe hadn't argued when Anya had insisted on taking the back seat. She and Ryan had chatted quietly to each other, leaving Anya to stare out the window and brood. They'd just turned off the motorway and were waiting at a set of traffic lights when she felt someone's eyes on her. Turning her head, Anya met Ryan's gaze via the rear-view mirror. "Everything okay back there?" A small laugh escaped unbidden. "Not so much." Ryan's responding chuckle was rueful. "Sorry, stupid question. There's a services here if you want to stop and grab a coffee." Anya shook her head. "No, I just want to get back home." Her voice hitched, and she swallowed the rest of the word. Halfmoon Quay meant a lot of things to her, but it had never felt like home. Though she'd always loved her visits over the years, and as much as her cousins had included her in everything, she'd still not truly been one of them. She didn't have the rock and sand of the village woven into her soul the way those that had lived there all their lives did. "To Freya," she amended. "Sure thing." The lights changed and Ryan navigated around the busy roundabout towards the turn-off that would leave them to Halfmoon Quay. Realising she'd been a little short with him, Anya loosened her belt and leaned forward to touch her uncle's shoulder. "I appreciate everything you're doing for me." "It's all good, Annie. You just focus on looking after Freya," Ryan said, keeping his eyes on the snaking queue of traffic ahead of them. Chloe half turned in her seat and smiled at her. "You look after Freya, and we'll look after you." Unable to find the words to express her gratitude, Anya nodded, then sank back against her seat, her gaze fixed once more on the familiar scenery. She knew every twist and turn of the road, every hill and landmark. There was the church steeple poking over the top of the trees. Here was the junction that always seemed to be a bottleneck, whatever time of day or night she passed through it. On the right, the faded peeling paintwork and graffitied boarded windows of a once bustling coaching inn, now long since closed down. Next came the long drag up the hill that had seemed to go on forever when she was younger, while her tummy bubbled with excitement and she'd stretched and strained in eager anticipation of that first magical glimpse of the glittering silver-blue sea and the grey, brooding walls of the castle standing watch on the promontory above the village. For the first time in her life, there was no excitement inside Anya as they crested the hill, and the picturesque view of Halfmoon Quay was laid out before her. The only emotion that gripped her insides was fear, accompanied by the never-ending drumbeat of words in her head that had been growing louder with each mile of their journey. "What am I going to do? What am I going to do?" Once they pulled up outside the sprawling, whitewashed stone house with its grey slate roof, there was no time to think as it was all hands on deck to unload the cars and hump all the boxes down to the end of the garden. Standing in the middle of the open-plan main living space of the summer house, Anya felt that familiar sense of rising panic again as she surveyed their piled-up belongings. Even though she thought she'd cut down everything to the bare minimum, it still felt like they'd never find room for everything. Her Aunt Helen came over and picked up a box. "Why don't you let us sort this out while you go to Ma and Pa's and fetch Freya?" Goodness, that sounded like a wonderful idea. But they'd already done so much for her, it felt rude to leave them to sort out her mess. Again. "Oh, I couldn't do that." She surveyed the stacks of boxes as she bit her lip. "I suppose we should unpack the clothes first. Or maybe the kitchen stuff?" She cringed a little inside, hearing the self-doubt in her own voice. She never used to be this indecisive. One of her great joys had been planning and designing the layout of their family home, and the compliments from guests about her eye for style had been a source of pride. Now they were a source of shame. knowing the money she'd spent on all those perfect accessories had been stolen from other people. Chloe planted her hands on her hips, a steely glint Anya knew well in her eye. Yes, you can. Look, we'll just find and unpack a few essentials, make the beds up, and everything else can go into the garage for now. That way you can take your time setting things up the way you want them over the coming days. Anya hesitated, still conscious of not taking advantage of them. I would like to go and make sure Freya's okay. Her cousin shooed her towards the door with a grin. Off you go then. Mum and I will be fine here, won't we? Helen nodded in agreement. I don't know why we didn't think of it in the first place. With Ryan and Matt's help, it won't take long to move most of this out of the way. We should be sorted by the time you get back with Freya. Thank you. Anya didn't know how many times those 2 words had passed her lips today, but it wasn't enough, could never be enough, to express her gratitude. I won't be long. The walk from her aunt and uncle's house to the old stone cottage where Amy and Ron Penrose lived wasn't far, and after hours sitting in the car and then moving boxes, she wanted to stretch her legs. Opting for a circuitous route, she headed not towards the castle, but instead around the sweep of the crescent-shaped harbour that had given the village its name. There were 1 or 2 commercial trawlers moored up at the top of the quay nearest the open water, stacks of lobster pots and tangles of old fishing nets piled up beside them, but the vast majority of the vessels tied up were small pleasure boats. Their white hulls and shiny masts glittered in the sun. The quayside was a hive of activity even this early in the summer season. Most of the people she passed were working on their boats, washing decks or touching up woodwork with pots of varnish that filled her nostrils with a stinging scent when the breeze blew across her face. There were quite a few holidaymakers around, mostly older couples taking advantage of the nice weather before the schools broke up and the village was inundated with sun-seekers. Here and there were families with very small children dressed up in bright T-shirts and floppy hats. The shops and businesses lining the road facing the quay were a mix of traditional and new. She couldn't help but smile at the sight of Mr. Hawthorne's newsagents, with its rack of buckets, spades and fishing nets waiting to tempt the enthusiastic sandcastle builders and rock poolers. She paused beneath the striped awning, the blue almost bleached out to match the white, to cup her hands and peer through the window. Just as she remembered, the shelves behind the counter were stacked high with plastic jars full of penny sweets. Oh, the agonising she, Chloe and Matt had done over what treats to buy with the shiny 50-pence pieces Ma and Pa would present them with. She'd have to bring Freya sometime and introduce her to the fizzy delights of sherbet spaceships and sticky strawberry laces. Stepping back, she spotted the column of little white cards lining the far side of the window, noting the help wanted announcements on a few. She didn't have time now, but she'd have to come back and check them out because, as soon as she'd got Freya settled in, the next thing on top of her worry list was finding a job. Anything would do, because someone with her lack of both a bank balance and anything resembling a CV couldn't afford to be fussy. Tomorrow would be soon enough to start looking. Mind made up, she carried on along the road past the faded glory of the old hotel, with its peeling window frames and a pair of straggly hanging baskets framing the entrance door. It had always been the jewel of the seafront, and it was sad to see it looking so neglected. A few doors down, the sleek black paintwork and shiny brass fixtures of one of the top-rated restaurants in the county provided an even starker contrast to the poor state of the other buildings, including a boarded-up shop next to it. Anya had vague memories of it being an old-fashioned dress shop, in every sense of the meaning. She'd never been in there, the dowdy frocks draped listlessly on headless display dummies enough to put off the trend-chasing teens she, Chloe, and her friend Issy had once been. Thinking about Issy immediately drew her attention across the road to where her friend's pretty cafe stood. Like the restaurant, the outside was well maintained, the collection of tables and chairs out front looking cheerful and welcoming with their little pots of sunny flowers that matched a pair of planters framing the door. A A shiny black and white sign declared the extension next to the cafe as the home of the Halfmoon Quay Community Hub. There'd been talk of it last time Anya had been down for a visit. Goodness, was that really nearly 3 years ago? She was glad to see Issy and Rick had managed to get it off the ground. Promising herself she'd pop in and catch up with her friends soon, Anya walked to the end of the road and turned left onto the narrow street of old fishermen's cottages where Ma and Pa lived. She'd barely lifted her finger off the bell when the front door opened and Ron Penrose greeted her with his familiar broad smile. "Well, well, look what the cat dragged in." Anya grinned, no offence taken at the greeting, which was part of Pa's collection of quirky phrases. Leaning forward, she pecked a kiss on his wrinkled cheek. "Hello, Pa. How are you?" "I've got 2 knackered knees, an acid reflux problem that means my belly's a volcano. All the air that used to be on my head has migrated to my nose and ears, and my wife says I snore like the brass section of an orchestra. Apart from that, everything's fine and dandy." Anya mock winced. "I'm sorry I asked." Ron gave her a cheeky grin before his expression grew serious. "I won't ask how you are, because I already know the answer. If that little shit wasn't already dead and buried, I'd string him up by his guts and let the seagulls feast on him for what he's put you through." For all his once strong frame was shrunken now, there was a fierce glint in Ron's eye that told Anya he was deadly serious. Such a bloodthirsty threat probably shouldn't be so comforting, but Ron had always been blunt and Anya appreciated he hadn't danced around the topic. God knows he deserved that and more, Pa, but it wouldn't have been worth the time. He's gone now, and that's all that matters. She placed a hand on his arm. "I know everyone is angry about what Drew did, but please, don't say anything in front of Freya, okay? She's been through enough, and she's too little to understand anything other than the fact that her daddy is gone." Ron held her gaze for a long moment before nodding once. "I'll not say another word about him." He stepped back and gestured. "Come on in, girly girl, and have a cuppa. Freya's in the kitchen with Amy. They've been baking." "How has she been?" Anya asked, keeping her voice low as they headed down the narrow hall to the back of the cottage. "Good as gold. It's been lovely having a little one around the place again. Makes me feel less like an old codger. 6 grandchildren, and not one of them showing so much as a hint of giving us any great-grandchildren to fuss over. Don't know what they've all been wasting their time with." Ron shook his head, but his wry grin was filled with pride. "Any time you want us to look after Freya while you get straight, just say the word." "I appreciate that, Pa, but I'm sure I'll manage." It was kind of him to offer, but she wasn't about to start abusing their good nature. Ron stopped in his tracks and frowned at her. "Don't cut your nose off to spite your face, Annie. We wouldn't offer if we didn't want to help." Annie raised a hand to touch the heated blush on her cheek. "Sorry, I didn't mean to be rude. Everyone's being so helpful and I don't want to take advantage." Ron pulled her into a hug that still carried the strength of a man who'd worked hard all his life. "Nonsense. Your family. Well, as good as." He was right. She needed to not let her pride and her guilt make life harder than it already was. Anya swallowed around the sudden lump in her throat. "Thanks, Pa. That means a lot. I'm going to be busy job hunting, so if I can drop Freya off for an hour or 2 over the coming days, that would help me out a lot." "Whatever you need," Ron assured her as he led her into the kitchen. The back of the cottage had been extended years ago to create a bright, airy kitchen diner with bifold doors onto the narrow patch of the original cobbled yard that was filled with plant pots. The doors stood open, letting in a soft breeze and easing the heat created by the oven. Wire racks full of rock cakes, butterfly cakes, and a square pan of what looked like Anya's favourite flapjack covered the round dining table, a testament to the morning's labours. Freya stood on a square red plastic stool that had been drawn up against the kitchen counter, stirring something in a large beige mixing bowl Amy was holding tightly in both hands. The moment she spotted Anya, Freya jumped down from the stool and ran over, still clutching the wooden spoon covered in cake mixture in one little hand. "Mummy, Mummy! We're caking!" Bending down, Anya scooped her up and propped her on one hip, doing her best to avoid the sticky spoon as she pressed a kiss to Freya's flour-covered cheek. "So I see, darling. Have you had a good time?" Freya nodded. "Ma and Pa have fun. Pa says he'll take me to the beach tomorrow. Can I go, Mummy?" Anya nodded. "If you like, but you'll have to promise to be a good girl and listen to exactly what Ma and Pa say, okay?" "Okay." Freya flung her arms around Anya's neck. The urge to clutch the little girl tight was overwhelming for a second, but Anya made herself give Freya a quick hug before setting her back down. "Come on then, show me what you've been making." They joined Amy back over by the counter while Ron made himself busy filling the kettle. "Hello, love." Amy leaned over and kissed Anya on the cheek before turning her attention to Freya. "I think we're ready to spoon this mixture out, don't you?" Anya leaned back against the counter, content to watch the pair of them fill the little paper cupcake liners. Freya got more on herself than in the cups, but Amy showed remarkable patience, rescuing the mess with a palette knife and deftly filling the liners, all the while keeping up a merry stream of encouragement and praise. By the time they'd finished and Freya was over at the sink where Ron helped her to wash her hands, the little girl was glowing with happiness. A soft touch on her hand drew Anya's gaze from her daughter to Amy's kind, concerned smile. "Everything all right?" Not sure she could go through it all again, Anya wrinkled her nose. Amy patted her hand. "You'll get there." Standing up straighter, Anya nodded. "I will. I'm going to start job hunting tomorrow. Ron said the two of you wouldn't mind watching Freya for me." "Of course we don't mind. She's an absolute delight. We'll have her any time you like. In fact, why don't we have her every morning for the whole week?" she offered. "It'll be better for Freya to have a routine, and it'll also give you a decent bit of time to settle in and look around for something." It felt like too much, but the sooner Anya got things sorted, the better. "If you're sure you don't mind." "Not a bit of it. It'll be our pleasure, won't it, Ron?" Amy called to her husband. "What's that?" "I was just saying to Anya we'd be happy to have Freya every morning for the coming week to help her out." Ron's face lit up like he'd been offered a treat, not been roped into a full-time babysitting gig. "Sounds good to me." He glanced down at Freya. "How about you, chicken? You want to spend lots of time with me and Ma next week?" "Yes, please." Freya jumped up and down. Ron beamed down at her. "Well, looks like that's sorted. Now then, why don't we sample some of these lovely-looking cakes before your mummy takes you home?" They returned home later than she'd been expecting, but Ma and Pa had been so lovely and time had quite run away with them all. Even after the gorgeous spread Ma had laid on for them, Anya hadn't been able to leave without a large Tupperware box full of cake. Worried about leaving the unpacking for so long, Anya walked as quickly as she could. Freya skipped along at her side, chattering away at a mile a minute. Ryan greeted them at the front door with a smile that widened considerably when Anya handed him the box. "What have we got here?" "Your mum and Freya have had a busy day baking lots of treats." "That sounds like the perfect excuse to put the kettle on." Anya smiled as she shook her head. "You go ahead. We're already full of tea and cake. I'm sorry we took so long. I think I'll just get Freya ready for bed and sort the rest out in the morning." Ryan waved them through the house towards the back patio doors. "Don't worry about it. We've moved all the boxes out the way and Helen and Chloe are just adding the last touches. I think you'll like what they've done." For the first time in months, Anya felt her spirits lift. Taking Freya's hand, she led her across the garden just in time to meet her aunt and cousin, who were coming out of the summer house. "Perfect timing," Chloe said by way of greeting. "Uncle Ryan tells me you've been busy." Anya raised an eyebrow. "What have you been up to?" "You can see for yourself." Chloe pushed the left-hand side of the double doors open. "Welcome to your new home." Tears burned hot and sudden as Anya stepped inside and was greeted with a miracle. It was impossible to believe she was standing in the same place that had been a chaotic mess only a couple of hours earlier. The 3-seater sofa Chloe had scavenged from a second-hand shop had been dressed with a soft cotton throw and plump cushions. A large pillar candle burned in the centre of the coffee table her cousin had bought for a few pounds through an online selling site. Familiar things from Anya's kitchen sat ready and waiting on the counter of the little kitchen area. A gauzy curtain covered in pretty flowers now hung at the end of the room, hiding the glass-panelled door that led to the bedroom area. At the opposite end of the room, the little chair and table from Freya's room sat in the middle of a pale pink fluffy rug, and a box of toys and a miniature bookcase filled with all her daughter's favourite books stood against the wall. A framed photo of the two of them sat atop of the bookcase, a smaller one of Drew tucked next to it. "It's beautiful," Anya murmured. Her aunt put an arm around her waist and gave her a squeeze. "It's enough to get you started," Helen said. "You can move things around as you want." Anya shook her head. "No, it's perfect as it is." She turned into her aunt's hold. "Thank you." She had to press her eyes tightly closed to stop the threatening tears from falling. Behind them, she heard Chloe asking Freya if she wanted to see the bedroom. Anya turned to watch her cousin slide back the curtain and push the door open before leading Freya by the hand into the other room. Her curiosity was piqued when she heard Freya squeal in delight, and Anya hurried over. She felt like squealing herself when she saw the bedroom. A single bed dressed with a quilt covered in Disney princesses had been pushed into the corner on the left-hand side. Fairy lights had been twined around the white headboard, and some of the pictures from Freya's old room had already been hung on the wall. Freya was splayed on her back on the bed, waving her arms and legs. "I've got a big girl bed!" "That's because you're a big girl now." Anya lay down beside her and pulled her into a hug. "What do you think? Do you like your new room?" "I love it." Freya snuggled in next to her. "And I like that I get to share it with you." Anya glanced across to where a small double bed had been tucked against the wall in the opposite corner. Unlike the bright cover beneath them, her bed had been dressed in cool tones of beige and white. With the wardrobe and a large chest of drawers, there wasn't a lot of floor space left, but it was a miracle they'd managed this much. She reached out her hand to Chloe. "You are amazing." Chloe's cheeks glowed pink. "It's not much, really. We just wanted to make you feel welcome. You've done that, and so much more." Chapter 3. "It's not just a one-off, it's every week." Gavin Bailey's face had been slowly turning red throughout his low-voiced diatribe, and Rick Penrose wondered if the man had had his blood pressure checked recently. "Every week," Gavin continued, leaning closer until Rick could smell the stale coffee on his breath. Resisting the urge to lean back, Rick held his body still. "Have you tried speaking to them about it?" Gavin had always been a bit of a fusspot, but he seemed to take offence at everything these days. He was a regular feature at the Monday morning outreach sessions Rick ran here at the community hub. The notebook resting at Rick's elbow was testament to the man's endless list of complaints, from kids hanging around on the benches outside his coffee shop to a delivery van for the clothing store next door overrunning the loading zone restrictions by 5 minutes one morning. Rick wondered sometimes how Gavin got any work done, because his face must be pressed up against the window 90% of the time. The hub was one of Rick's proudest achievements, and he'd been over the moon when Issy had agreed to host it at the cosy coffee pot. He was sure it rankled Gavin that his direct rival had been chosen for the hub, but it made sense to concentrate their limited resources under one roof, especially when Issy had already been doing the hard work. From weekly coffee mornings for new parents to her incredibly popular OAP's Friday lunch bargain, whenever she saw a gap in the community, Issy had done her best to fill it. With the support of the entire council, Rick had applied for a development grant from a government renewal scheme, and they'd extended the coffee pot into a vacant premises next door to create the hub. "You think they don't know what they're doing? They don't care if their rubbish bags split open because Muggin's here. We'll clean it up." Gavin jabbed a thumb into his own chest. Rick could appreciate the man's frustration. The whole village had a seagull problem, and the council had spent a considerable portion of their limited budget on installing spikes and other deterrent measures where they could. Not always easy when there was a balance to be struck with preserving the traditional look of the buildings that so appealed to visitors to the area. "What exactly do you want me to do about it, Gavin?" "Issue them with better bags instead of that cheap, thin rubbish." Rick clenched his jaw for a moment but managed to keep his voice even. "We changed the bags to be biodegradable because that's what everyone wanted, remember?" Gavin had been the one behind the bloody petition because Java Brava, the international coffee chain he was the local franchisee for, had been on a green kick after customers had put pressure on them to improve their environmental credentials. Gavin scowled. "Well, that's because we expected you to do the right thing. But you've done it on the cheap, just like you do everything else around here." Rick left that bait well alone. "I'll send an email to the business mailing list reminding people not to put their rubbish out too early, and I'll arrange for the summer wardens to do an extra patrol to make sure everyone is complying." Reaching for his notebook, Rick opened it and wrote down a reminder on his to-do list. When he'd finished, he capped his pen and set it down, then made himself smile at the still glaring man opposite. "Is that everything for today?" Gavin shoved his chair back with a snort. "I don't know why I keep wasting my time, because it's not like you ever do anything useful, unless it's for one of your friends, of course." He cast a significant look around the room they were in, his upper lip curled in a sneer of disgust that took in Issy, who was standing behind the counter, sharing a joke with her grandmother. Determined to ignore the provocation, Rick stayed in his seat and held a neutral smile as Gavin rose. "I'll make sure that email goes out today," he said, but received only a brief glare before Gavin's attention was drawn elsewhere. "Katrina, come on. I need you back at the shop." Rick half turned to see Gavin's daughter clutching a book to her chest, a deer in the headlights expression widening her dark eyes. "But it's my morning for volunteering here, Dad." One of the advantages of building the hub was that they'd been able to create a small library. The grant had covered enough to provide a starter stock, which they had supplemented with donations and fundraising events, but there hadn't been enough to cover a salary. Issy had put her skills to work and recruited a team of volunteers to help her keep it running, including Kat, who was one of her closest friends. Abandoning the cafe counter, Issy approached her friend and took the book from her hands with a smile. "It's fine, Kat. I can keep an eye on things here if your dad needs you." The small brunette cast a glance over to where her father was waiting, one hand holding the door open, his brows drawn down in an impatient glower. Rick didn't miss the brief hesitation, as though Cat considered standing her ground, but it was gone in a flash. Surrendering any thoughts of defiance, she bent down to gather her bag and cardigan. It was warm enough for most people to be in t-shirts or summer dresses, but Cat enveloped her small frame in the long woolen garment. "I'll see you on Friday," she promised Issy before hurrying towards the door. She hadn't reached it before Gavin released it and walked out, forcing her to make a grab for it before it shut in her face. Clutching the saucer of a large cappuccino in two hands, Maud, Issy's eccentric, flamboyant grandmother, teetered across from the counter and took the seat opposite Rick. Her short, bobbed hair had been dyed a fetching shade of candy floss pink that matched her sequin-covered t-shirt and cropped trousers. No one was ever going to miss Maud in a crowd, that was for sure. "Well then," she said, nodding behind her towards the door. "What's he got his knickers in a twist about today?" Rick bit the inside of his cheek to ward off a grin. "Come on now, Maud. Be nice." Maud snorted. "I've wiped and powdered your backside more than once, Rick Penrose, so don't come the high-handed councilman with me." The problem with growing up in a close community like Halfmoon Quay was that everyone knew everything about each other. Deciding to fight fire with fire, Rick picked up his pen and tapped it idly on the cover of his notebook. "So tell me, Maud, did you come over here just to remind me you're the same age as my granny, or did you have an issue that you wanted to raise?" "Cheeky boy." Maud's smile told him she had taken no insult. "I want you to have a word with your Uncle Davy. He's driving me to distraction with all his stupid rules." Rick sighed. Davy was actually his great-uncle, but he didn't think now was the time to give Maud another reminder of her age. He ran a hotel on Harbour Parade and accommodated a handful of full-time residents as well as regular holiday-makers. Privately, Rick thought it was all getting a bit much for Davy, and he knew both his father Jago and his Uncle Ryan had told him as much. But Davy wouldn't be a Penrose if he didn't have a stubborn streak. All he would say on the matter was that things were in hand and there was nothing to worry about. Still, whatever his private misgivings, Rick wouldn't be a Penrose either if he didn't back another member of his family to the hilt. "Is this about the cats again?" The way Maud bristled, Rick knew he'd hit the nail on the head. "I can't stop them coming in my window now, can I?" "But you could stop encouraging them by putting food out," Rick pointed out, not at all unreasonably to his way of thinking. "And let them starve?" Maud placed a hand over her heart, her voice rising to an almost theatrical tone of outrage. And this was why he should mind his own business sometimes. Thankfully, Rick was saved by the appearance of Issy at her grandmother's back. "Nan, you do realise you jumped the queue, don't you?" Rick glanced over to where a couple of other residents were sitting on the comfortable chairs in the hub and raised a hand in apology before turning back to Maud. "You know I can't get in the middle of this. If you've got a problem with any of the rules at the hotel, then you need to speak to Davy about it." Issy huffed a sigh before her grandmother could reply. "Tell me this isn't about the bloody cats, Nan." Ignoring her, Maud fixed her fierce, electric blue eyeliner-enhanced gaze on Rick. "I think you should speak to him." There was none of Maud's usual teasing or sass in her tone, and Rick got the feeling the ongoing dispute between her and his great-uncle was merely an excuse. He nodded. "I'll pop in later on my way home from work." Maud's cheery smile returned in an instant. "Good boy." She stood and picked up her cup before turning to her granddaughter. "I need you to help me. I've seen the most amazing new nail polish on Instagram, but I can't decide if Sparkle Fairy Queen or Vava Vamp is more my colour." Putting an arm around Maud's waist, Issy laughed as the pair of them headed over to a table nearer the counter. "Both sound perfect, Nan." Rick smiled briefly after them before his attention was drawn away by the next person taking their seat opposite him, and for the next couple of hours he didn't have time to dwell on Maud's cryptic message about visiting Davy. He was just finishing up and packing his things away when Issy came over and handed him a paper bag and an insulated mug. "What's this?" he asked with a smile. "Lunch. Your usual." He hadn't even thought about it, but the moment she said the word, his stomach began to rumble. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. Issy closed her hand over his before he could take out any money. "No, it's on the house." He considered arguing with her, but knew it was pointless. Issy could give them all a run for their money when it came to digging her heels in. "You know it's possible to be too generous, right?" he grumbled as he tucked his wallet away. She gave him a look that spoke volumes. "Says the man who gives up more of his time than anyone else in Halfmoon Quay." God, she made him sound like a superhero when he was just doing what anyone else would in his situation. "Maybe I should start wearing a cape or something." Issy laughed before her face grew serious. "You shouldn't joke about it, Rick. What you do means a lot." She pressed the bag and mug into his hands. "Don't forget to pop in and see Davy. I know Nan can be a bit of a drama queen sometimes. I don't think this is just her making a fuss." Rick winced, having forgotten about his promise to Maud. "Did she tell you what the problem really is?" "No, only that she's worried." He sighed. "I was going to call in after work, but I guess I should go over there now. Just let me give Mum a quick call and see if she'll hold the fort a bit longer." His mother, Rachel, ran a chandlery shop on the quay, catering to the needs of the local sailors as well as the enthusiasts who packed the harbour with their pleasure boats every summer. Rick had started out working for her, but had slowly built up the hire hut, his water sports rental service, on the side. Though spending all day with your mother wasn't everyone's idea of a good time, both she and his father, who was the harbour master, were more like friends than parents these days, and the arrangement worked well for both of them. He transferred the sandwich bag into the hand also holding his coffee and took out his phone. As the call connected, the bell above the cafe door opened.